everyone for being here. Good morning and welcome to the American Journal of Bioethics webinar, The End of Roe v. Wade. My name is Dr. Alyssa Burgart. I'm the digital media editor for the journal, as well as for bioethicstoday.org, which is formerly bioethics.net. I'm excited to moderate this conversation with an incredible panel of 3 bioethics scholars, all with extensive expertise in reproductive justice and abortion rights. Our upcoming issue will include special editorials from each of these speakers, highlighting the bioethics impact of restrictions on reproductive rights. We invite your questions during this presentation. Please feel free to enter them into the Q&A section. There's a button towards the bottom of your screen, and make sure to upvote any questions that you find particularly interesting. And now I will introduce our esteemed panelists. Mary Ziegler is the Stearns Weaver Miller Professor of Law at Florida State University College of Law and the Daniel P.S. Paul Visiting Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. She is the author of several books on the struggles around reproduction in the United States, including the award-winning After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate. Her new book, Dollars for Life, The Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment, will be published by Yale University Press in June 2022. Mary Faith Marshall is the Cornfield Foundation Professor and Director of the Center for Health Humanities and Ethics and Director of the Program in Biomedical Ethics in the UVA School of Medicine. With her colleagues Lois Shepard and Julia Taylor, she co-founded its program, Studies in Reproductive Ethics and Justice. Her scholarship and advocacy work include coercive interventions in pregnancy, policy approaches to perinatal substance use disorder, pandemics and pregnancy, and abortion. She has served on the American College of Gynecology Ethics Committee and is a primary author of its committee opinions, Refusal of Medically Recommended Treatment During Pregnancy and Forming a Just Healthcare System. Katie Watson is the Associate Professor at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, where she's an award-winning teacher of medical ethics, medical humanities, and constitutional law. She is the author of Scarlet A, The Ethics, Law, and Politics of Ordinary Abortion. And her articles on abortion appear in publications including the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, The Lancet, and the New Yorker. Professor Watson began her career in public interest law, and in 2017-2018, she returned to practice part-time as a senior counsel to the Women's and Reproductive Rights Project of the ACLU of Illinois. Professor Watson is a member of the board of the National Abortion Federation, the Planned Parenthood National Media Council, and the Ethics Committee of the International FIGO. With that, we'll move into our content. In 1973, the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade established a constitutional right to abortion. Nearly 50 years later, with the court shifted to a conservative majority, the right to abortion currently hangs in the balance. Given the court's reception to the recent cases of SB 8 in Texas and Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, it's possible the court will eliminate a constitutional right to abortion or leave it so poorly protected as to be inaccessible to many. And so with that, I'd like to start with you, Katie. You've written extensively on the topic of ordinary abortion, and you point out that 1 in 4 women has had an abortion. So to frame this impact of abortion on really everyday Americans, what is it about the ordinary nature of abortion care that makes this decision facing the court so daunting?
Thank you, Alyssa. There's several things that are important. That if current rates remain steady, 1 in 4 American women will have an abortion by menopause, and this is exclusive of miscarriage. And the numbers for older women are higher. They're more like 1 in 3. This is actually the lowest rate since Roe versus Wade. And so when I focused on ordinary abortion, my idea was to kind of get us away from this abortion exceptionalism that tells us, even academics, bioethicists, that abortion is different from every other medical issue, every other social issue in so many ways. And one of the ways it's not different is it's so incredibly common. It's a procedure that 25% of American people capable of pregnancy will undergo. So that felt important to me. It's not just the numbers. As a clinical ethicist, I'm trained to see each patient as a moral agent. And so when we call ourselves pro-choice, which I think many people are very transparent about doing, that's a legal position. It's not an ethical position, right? But those are our patients and the clinicians who serve them saying abortion feels ethical to me. And I think their voices have been ignored. A couple other details I'd like to fill in there. No person capable of pregnancy knows whether they'll be in the 1 or the 3. So there's a psychological impact to banning abortion, the anxiety that comes for every woman of saying, will I be able to finish graduate school? Will I be able to continue my employment? Will this one night stand turn into a lifetime co-parenting relationship, right? That's a psychological burden for all women. I also want to name men. It takes 2 people to create a pregnancy. And in my book, I address how we've omitted men from the decision. So saying they have no right to contribute or control an abortion decision doesn't mean they're dramatically impacted by the woman's abortion decision. And often couples get together because they share values and life goals. So I talk about male beneficiaries of the abortion right. I also want to say that abortion bans are a form of symbolic violence towards all women. I don't care if you're a nun, you're postmenopausal, or you're a gold star lesbian, and you are not at any risk of accidental pregnancy. This is the government telling you that an embryo is more important than you are, right? And so it's a form of symbolic violence to all women, whether they are capable of pregnancy or not. And lastly, I think we cannot lose sight of the fact of the disparity element of this issue. And the article that I wrote for this special issue is titled The Ethics of Access, Reframing Abortion Care as a Healthcare Disparity and a Matter of Reproductive Justice. And that's because I think we are wrong to overlook the fact that 59% of abortion patients are people of color, as compared to 38% in the general population. And it's disproportionately a service needed and used by low-income women. 49% of abortion patients have incomes below the poverty level, and another 26% are between 100 and 200%. So we can say 75% of all abortion patients are low income. That's not even naming the gender issue that only women need this medical service, right? So between gender, race, economic level, and then we could go into the geography barriers, we could go into all sorts of other things. It's a classic healthcare disparity issue, access to abortion, but that's never on our lists. And so my article attempts to break through that abortion exceptionalism and saying we should be talking about access, the ethics of access, which is a separate analysis than the ethics of the act of abortion, which the patient and the clinician have already agreed is ethical. There's a lot more to talk about once you go beyond that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mary, I'd like to move on to you. The approach to Roe really as a fundamental right to abortion has really diminished over the last 50 years in the various cases that we've seen. How is it that abortion legislation became this really key political issue within the conservative movement?
Well, I think so. There's the anti-abortion movement, which is distinct from the conservative movement, and the relationship between the two wasn't always straightforward. So there were some people you might sort of view as social justice Catholics early on who thought that as important as they viewed criminal prohibitions of abortion, it would be equally important, for example, to limit discrimination against pregnant workers or to expand healthcare access for neonatal care or maternal care. And then there was the conservative movement independently that I think viewed the anti-abortion movement as a potential way to undermine the GOP establishment and change its policies in a wide variety of settings. And that shift began in the 70s. It accelerated in the 80s. And it was really not until the 80s that you could coherently say that the Republican Party was the anti-abortion party and the Democratic Party was the pro-choice party. And the transformations, I think, continued because the relationship between the anti-abortion movement and the GOP has proved to be, I think, tremendously profitable, both literally and figuratively for both. I think the anti-abortion movement realized that control of the U.S. Supreme Court could be of incredibly powerful get out the vote tool for a wide variety of conservative constituencies that had ambitions that seemed to be unachievable through ordinary politics, right? So, a kind of universal right to carry a concealed firearm is not something that you're going to see passed through Democratic legislatures in every state in the United States. A nationwide ban on abortion, where abortion could be defined to include, for example, emergency contraceptives, is not something that you're going to see passed in Congress or in every state in the union. So the idea that instead of having to amend the Constitution or win a kind of messy state by state battle, you could instead focus on controlling who sat on the Supreme Court. That argument, I think, became an effective tool for a GOP that was trying to smooth over the differences between its constituencies. And it became a way for the anti-abortion movement to secure influence in the GOP when anti-abortion leaders didn't have a particularly large amount of money compared to certain mega donors. So this kind of partnership, it was a fraught partnership at times, has certainly transformed the US Supreme Court. And I don't mean just in the sense of who sits on the US Supreme Court, although that's true enough. It's also changed how the court really, I think, approaches a lot of things. So if you asked political scientists or legal scholars or historians, they would tell you for long stretches of time that the US Supreme Court rarely departs very far from popular opinion, and also tends to be very plugged into opinion among bioethicists and doctors, that the court is rarely acting in a truly counter-majoritarian fashion, as legal scholar Alexander Bickel put it in the 60s. And I think through this partnership between the anti-abortion movement and the GOP, there was a recognition that to reverse Roe, you would need to have a court that either believed that polling suggesting that Roe was popular was wrong, or quite simply that didn't care about potential political fallout from the overruling of Roe. Not just the kinds of practical fallout that would affect people of color and low-income people and others accessing abortion, but just fallout in elections, fallout that could lead to reforms to the Supreme Court, that you would need a court that was indifferent to all of those prospects. And that I think that effort has been, at least so far, seems to have succeeded, because we see a court that's acting very differently than what we've come to expect across a number of areas of American life that might interest bioethicists. And we've seen with the creation of that court an escalation in the kinds of abortion legislation we're seeing in the states. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because what we've been seeing for decades has been largely for public consumption, for what the anti-abortion movement thinks the Supreme Court wants to hear and what it thinks national politicians like to see. It hasn't been a reflection of what the movement actually wants. So with the kind of escalation of more stringent legislation, we're really for the first time beginning to see what the world will look like after Roe is gone in terms of the types of punitive laws that are going to be in place. Although I think we're only beginning to see the truth of that now.
Thank you. Mary Faith, so, even prior to these most recent cases, SB 8, Dobbs, access to timely abortion services has been drastically limited in many parts of America for some time. So if Roe is overturned and or these laws like SB 8 are allowed to continue on unchecked, what sort of impacts do you see on pregnant people? And I want to just take a moment. We know this impacts not only women, but really anyone with a uterus. So for pregnant people and their autonomy, what sort of impacts do you expect?
Thank you. I want to start by saying this is certainly personal to me. I've had more than one abortion. The first when I was an undergraduate back in the 1970s, and had one of the infamous Delcon shields implanted in my uterus. And so that speaks to the failures of contraception, just in addition to, the need that we're all speaking about for access to abortion. I'm going to take things a little further, broaden it out, and I'm going to say that limited access to abortion services actually affects all of us. Right? Not just persons of reproductive capacity, not just pregnant persons, but all of us and our families. And I'm going to give you maybe a specific example why, based on a bill that has been put forward in South Carolina, which is the Equal Protection for Unborn Babies Act. And that was moved forward on January 13th of this year. And it's currently there in the Senate Committee on Medical Affairs. the Lynn Paltrow and her advocacy organization, National Advocates for Pregnant Women, filed some testimony in opposition of this bill, and they outlined beautifully the potential that this legislation and others around the country could have for all of us. And certainly the bill in South Carolina, which recognizes pregnancy as beginning at conception, which it does obviously, but that restrictions on abortion should begin then, is something that has happened all in other places around the country. And I want to say there was recently an interesting argument made by Garrett Soldano, who is a chiropractor, who is a gubernatorial candidate in Michigan. And he said in an interview that there should be an abortion ban from pregnancies resulting from rape or from incest. And he went on further to say, this is the interesting part, that life begins when DNA is created, and that DNA deserves a right at the table, and I'm quoting him, on whether it should live or not. And we must always protect that DNA and allow it to become a person who might go on to become president. So we could talk about the fact that he wasn't paying attention to biochemistry when he was in chiropractic school, and that life actually began somewhere around 3.7 billion years ago, when the first DNA molecules were formed and were capable of replication. But what's happening in South Carolina and around the country has the possibility and the realities already, and has for a long time, of consequences for all of us. So let's think about some specific categories. Let's think about, for example, pregnant persons who experience a stillbirth or a miscarriage. And we know that somewhere around 20% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage or stillbirth. So the implication of this act and of others is that a person who loses a pregnancy by stillbirth or miscarriage could be prosecuted, could be investigated, interrogated, arrested, and prosecuted if someone believes that their action has done something to foster that loss of pregnancy. And there are well-documented cases around the country. I'm just going to mention one. Angela Shanette Kennedy in South Carolina, who experienced a stillbirth at Spartanburg Regional Medical Center in 1998. And she was interrogated by the police after her delivery and the loss. And she was asked by one of the male detectives, did you do everything in your power to ensure that you would have a healthy baby? Right. She was charged with homicide by child abuse. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of criminal child endangerment rather than face a homicide trial. And she received a 5-year prison sentence for the crime of suffering a stillbirth. Others, people who need in vitro fertilization or fertility treatment. So under these restrictive laws, those that define an unborn baby as someone as a person, from fertilization on, then disposing of fertilized eggs and embryos that are created for in vitro fertilization and that are not implanted would then violate criminal homicide, abuse, and assault laws. And the donors and the providers in the facility could be at risk of criminal or civil punishment for denying embryos the right to life. Others, women who do anything that, quote, risks harm to a fertilized egg, an embryo, or a fetus. And I'll say lastly that that many of these laws have gone on to deprive pregnant persons and their born children, right, of an intact family, because children are taken away and put into the vagaries of the foster care system if they're not lucky enough to be placed with family members. And then all of us, especially all persons capable of becoming pregnant or who are pregnant, of being able to have a trusting relationship with their healthcare providers. And the fact that that isn't the case leads not only to not having good prenatal care, right, but also that mistrust carries over into relationships with physicians in family medicine and in other venues, and we know that quite well, that those issues are alive and well, certainly among communities that have suffered at the hands of medical indifference in the past.
Thank you. I wonder if Mary or Katie, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that's worth having on the radar is the kind of personhood initiative that Mary Faith describes is not something that we're likely to see just in conservative states, although that's what we are likely to see in these states, precisely because many of us think of the anti-abortion movement as being a movement to reverse Roe v. Wade, and historically that's just not true. It's called the Right to Life movement for a reason. The movement's goal is to have a nationwide ban on abortion, and of course, if you look now at where rates of abortion are highest and where the absolute number of abortions are the highest, they tend to be either in purple states like Florida or in blue states like California or New York. So for the anti-abortion movement to really have the kind of effect it wants, it's going to have to change things nationwide. And the most likely way to do that is to try to ask the Supreme Court to hold that abortion is unconstitutional, right? So if this Supreme Court is willing to reverse Roe v. Wade, there's already groundwork being laid by anti-abortion lawyers to argue that the Constitution, essentially the people who wrote the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, viewed a fetus as a rights-holding person, and that therefore abortion violates fetal rights to due process of the law and equal protection of the laws. And so this is sort of, I think, a way of both a recognition on the part of anti-abortion folks that there's no way democratically that you would see the kind of policy Mary Faith described in South Carolina being applied, in New York, but also a pretty keen awareness that the U.S. Supreme Court may be willing to go places that popular politics are not when it comes to abortion. So I think down the road, we'd be looking at questions about whether these kinds of personhood policies will apply to a larger subset of folks. And there'll also be legal questions, I think, about whether people who try to provide care in states that do have legal abortion will face any kind of consequences from states that have criminalized abortion, and whether people who are pregnant who travel out of state to get care, right? So you can posit someone from South Carolina who's going to travel to California to get an abortion. Can that person then be punished when they return to South Carolina? So there's a lot, I think the scope of the kinds of punishments we're going to see when we're talking about personhood go beyond just the usual concerns about low-income people of color in states that are conventionally red states who are often forgotten in these debates. It could potentially apply to a much larger group of people.
Thank you. Everyone, we invite your questions, so please make sure you submit them to the Q&A, and again, upvote any questions you find particularly interesting. Katie, you have written extensively, especially in your book, Scarlet A, about really having more in-depth conversations with each other about abortion and how can we talk more openly about that. And I've heard from, bioethicists who say, wow, it's really hard to even touch on this issue in our classes because it's such a divisive issue. You have so much experience in this space. And I wonder, do you have advice for people who are attempting to have these conversations, with their neighbors, with other scholars, with their students?
Yeah, I mean, I have some suggestions. None of them are foolproof, but the first is to change your goal. If your goal is consensus, have a seat. You know, we have not agreed on abortion for 50 years, centuries. We're not gonna, and that doesn't trouble me at all. That's like saying in 250 years we haven't picked the best religion in the United States. Our religious experiment has failed. No, it hasn't, right? And so change your goal from consensus or persuasion to reciprocal respect and understanding. And that's a curiosity is a great place to start. What do you think and why do you think that? That's fascinating. Versus now let me change that in this one dinner conversation, right? The second is clarifying, and this is very difficult, the difference between what I think of as the honest abolitionists versus the closet misogynists. There are some people, you know, if you have a poster that says, fetuses are people, I'm trained to respect that. If you have a poster that says women should be chained to the stove, I'm actually going to be in the middle of your rally disagreeing, right? And so I talk in my book about Trojan horse arguments. How much is an anti-abortion argument, an argument about let's go back to old-fashioned gender roles? Or is this person like someone who accepts women's autonomy, but genuinely struggles with the moral status of embryos and fetuses? Those are very different conversations. I actually don't have a hot minute for the misogynists, and I have a lot of time for the deeply sincere and troubled on this issue. And the third is distinguishing between legality and morality. And like, I think adultery is just desperately immoral, and I'm not impressed. And I'm, you know, I'd have to be persuaded if a friend said this was fine with them. And you know what I mean? Like, I have moral stances on all sorts of things, but I don't think it should be like a criminal sanction and regulated by the state. And so I have learned that when people say they're pro-choice, I have in the past assumed that meant they thought abortion was ethical. And I have been fascinated to hear like very active advocates, when I was writing my book, whisper to me, I mean, I don't know if it's ethical. I mean, you know, honestly, you're killing a person, probably, but who am I to say that for someone else? And then I give the example in my book of a pro-life physician who I really love. He does refer, but he refuses to do procedures and has very clear reasons why. I always assumed he would want abortion to be illegal. And like 8 years into our professional relationship, I had the brains to say, so do you want abortion to be illegal? And he said, no, then we'd just be back to septic wards. I want abortion to be unnecessary. And I thought, wow, that's why I can feel like I can work with this person. So help, and that's where I think you can change minds. When people are anti-abortion, teasing out, but if someone else's religion says that they can, or, you know, the 59% of abortion patients who are mothers, the 73% who say one of their reasons is I can't afford another baby. If someone's doing this to protect their family, you know, they share your values about motherhood or children or family, but this is what they think is, do you want to send them to jail? And often you have a different, and maybe they say, yeah, I have to because they're killing someone, or they say something different. So I think just the curiosity and the openness versus that divisiveness. So I do teach in medical school, and the last sentence I'll say is I start our Repro-G unit with an hour-long lecture on reproductive justice to say, if you're only talking about abortion and you're not talking about the right to have a child and the right to parent your children with dignity and safety, and then also gender freedom and sexual pleasure, you've only got one part of the elephant, right? So putting it in context is helpful. And then I teach a separate session on conscience in abortion care, in which I highlight positive conscience, the right to perform an abortion and the right to not, but centering patients' conscience, because there's two consciences in the room, and we only talk about clinicians, which is amazing to me. And that step one is, how do we get everyone care? And step two is, how do we make our healthcare workforce comfortable and work well together? And I start by saying, I want to say in the nicest possible way, I don't care what you think about abortion. I care what your patients need and how you are going to navigate your values and your patient's need for care. That's what we're going to talk about today. I don't need to get you in a debate or a conflict, because that's kind of not where we are. We're about patient values. And in this area, your values are relevant to what you will do in your practice. So I don't want to pretend like it's always perfect, or everyone has to figure out their own approach, their own curriculum. But I want to say to the folks on this webinar, I mean, feel free to call me, and I'm sure any of the other panelists for ideas. But one of the most important things we can do as academics is talk about it and not fall prey to the abortion exceptionalism that says we can't teach this. Because if we can't talk about it in medical school or college or philosophy graduate school, how in the world are we going to critique the debates in the public square if we in academia can't facilitate a productive, civil, rich conversation? That's literally our jobs. So let's do them.
Thank you. Mary Faith, some people have argued, listen, turning Roe, if Roe is overturned and that decision is turned back to the states, some say, hey, that's a good thing because it shows that, we have a pluralistic society and each state should regulate the access that they have to reproductive care. So what are the pitfalls of this approach from your perspective?
I want to first of all second what Katie has just said, especially in terms of teaching students. My colleague Lois Shepard and I teach a course every year on reproductive ethics and the law, and it's a course for law students, medical students, graduate nursing, and public health students. We're teaching it as we speak. We did abortion last night. And these students are just aces, and it's a privilege to teach them. So thank you for your wisdom, Katie, about how to go about having those conversations in class. And if we fail to make that situation a safe space where we can disagree, then as teachers and certainly as ethicists, then we're failing miserably at our jobs. So I second what you had to say. A couple of thoughts on this moving forward, and one is that the data clearly show, and we have data from the Pew Research Center from research that they conducted in April of 2021. So it's relatively recent data. And these data have been consistent for many years, most especially over the last 5 years, that, the majority of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, 59% of Americans, as opposed to 39% of those who think that it should be illegal. And I would say of the 59% who think that it should be legal in all or most cases, their greater concern is that states are making it too difficult to have access to an abortion. And you can break it down either further than that. Mary has referred to this already. If you break it down by religion, for example, then 77% of white evangelical Protestants believe that abortion should be illegal. For those of us like me who are religiously unaffiliated, then a vast majority, 82%, think access should be legal. And that's true of 64% of Black Protestants, 63% of white non-evangelical Protestants, and 55% of Roman Catholics. Breaking it down by political party, 80% of Democrats think that access to abortion should be legal. 63% of Republicans that it should be illegal. And you can break it down further by other demographics, race and ethnicity, race being, as we all know, a social construct, not a biological one. Age, those who are less than 30 years old, 67% of them think that it should be legal. And if you look at education, which is interesting because this is also mirrored in terms of political affiliations, that 68% of those who have graduated from college think it should be legal. those who have some college, 61%, high school or less, about 50%, 47% of whom think that it should be illegal. So I think that perhaps one of the sad things is that in most of the states that where there is some neutrality on access to abortion, or that are clearly where the majority of the citizens are in favor of it, their preferences, their political preferences, their policy preferences are not being heard by legislators. The only states where there's a clear majority of state citizens who are in favor of legislation that makes access to abortion illegal are West Virginia, Kentucky, Arizona, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Right. So all other states, there's either neutrality or the citizens are in favor of it. So I think that's perhaps a disservice that we could talk about in terms of legislators serving those who elected them and their clear preferences.
Thank you. To get for even deeper into this issue of states' rights and states' obligations, Mary, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, we've seen the courts don't seem to have that much interest in preventing undue burdens on people seeking abortions, especially in these states where there are significant limitations. But that means as well that, for example, with SB 8, we've seen that patients from Texas are traveling to far distant states in order to obtain abortion services. So is there any sort of obligation that states have to other states in terms of the burdens that these place on the states that actually still have abortion available?
I mean, legally, no, but I think if states are serious about expanding access to abortion after Roe is gone, that's really where the move is. Because so far, if you look at what states have been doing in anticipation of the Supreme Court overruling Roe in June, progressive states have either been codifying abortion rights in their states, which is fine, but is ultimately a symbolic gesture, right? I mean, is there any realistic possibility in the foreseeable future that Vermont is going to criminalize abortion? Like, no, there is not, right? I'm here to tell you today. So if you learned anything from me in this, it's that. They're sometimes also expanding who can perform abortion services, right? So some states long had restrictions limiting abortion services to licensed physicians. So there are physician extenders or nurse practitioners or other folks who are being included. But California was the only state, I think, that signaled that it might be interested in funding access to abortion for out-of-state patients, right? That could cover not only the actual underlying medical services, but the costs of travel, accommodations, and so on. And that's really, I think, if there's going to be any meaningful step that progressive states take to addressing disparities in abortion access after Roe, it's going to have to look like that. Because if you have I've seen leaders of progressive states saying, our clinics are bumping up our capacity in anticipation of people traveling from out of state. And that's fine. But I think, as both Katie and Mary Faith were saying, that the ability to travel out of state is something that's going to be entirely off limits for large subsets of potential patients, right? And that those disparities are going to fall along racial lines, geographical lines, and other lines that should make us uncomfortable. And simply saying, if you manage on your own to get the resources together to get here, we'll have enough, physician extenders to offer you care is not really much of an answer. So that obviously that step will come with potentially many more legal complications for states that choose to do that. It will come with more expense because, of course, funding abortion for people from out of state expands the bill that you're going to have to foot for your commitment to abortion access. But I think by the same token, it's probably a much more meaningful step in terms of what would actually translate to change on the ground versus just virtue signaling, which is, I think, a lot of what we've seen from states thus far.
I just tack on, if I may, just 2 sentences. I have a slight disagreement with Mary that these codifications are just have symbolic value. And maybe it's because I work in a medical setting, that the inherent conservatism of doctors, that the chilling effect of the not knowing what the law is and not having explicit permission is real. So if you're in a state that's considering codification, I say go for it, because it gives clarity. Physicians want to read, I can do this in such a contested area. And if we have a Supreme Court case saying you don't have a constitutional right to it, there's a lot of physicians who want to see a statutory right to it. That can also change with the next legislature. So your next move is to amend or make explicit in your state constitution and have something more protected. The second piece is with states paying for it. I just want to throw out a concern I have is it takes political pressure off the states where it's banned. And so it allows at least some number of people to travel and get them and takes pressure off. And so something I worry about, for patients today, I want everyone to get the care they need. But when we have a patchwork system where other states absorb, we have free states and slave states essentially, but we have absorption, it allows red states to say we're pro-life and also not have the pressure of the harm. I don't want that harm, but it's really interesting to think in political process and history terms, how that works. And then thirdly, I just want to say, this is a pitch I'd make in my article, we need to reverse the Hyde Amendment, right? The federal piece of Medicaid legislation. And there's legislation in Congress now to do that, needs to move, but we need to restore that funding. And Medicaid's tricky. It's a federal state partnership and you need approval. It's hard to use your state Medicaid in another state. And a number of states have authorized Medicaid use for all abortion, and a handful. They need to expand so you can use your state piece of the money. But if we could get past reversal, of the Hyde Amendment, that a Medicaid in a reproductive justice framework covers all childbirth, covers all abortion, the government is neutral on your childbearing decisions, with a waiver that says you have automatic out-of-state approval for this service. That is still not going to remove travel cost and all the other barriers, but it would open the door for a new group of people who aren't covered by their Florida or Virginia Medicaid, but that the federal piece of it potentially could pay for when they get to a clinic out of state. So I think we just have to be so creative, and there's tension. I'm in a state that has that codification, that has clinics that are ramping up, and we already have 16% of our patients are from out of state already, because we're the donut hole in our Midwestern region. It's so hard to strategize and think both short-term assistance and long-term. It's really hard. And yet we all have to be swinging at it.
Yeah, I think that's right, because they're trade-offs. Because if you look historically at different strategies for resisting Supreme Court decisions like this, often the more open the problem, the easier the political and even legal strategies become. But there are a lot of sacrifices that have to be made to advance those strategies. And those often come in the form of specific people who are suffering, right? Who's suffering then. And so it's not, I totally agree that there's no easy solutions.
And I'd like to add in on this, maybe thinking about, as Katie said, other sort of creative approaches, right, to this problem, and some of which are not, legislative, right, or health law approaches. And I'm thinking back to a specific instance when I sat on the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Ethics Committee, an opinion that was written by the committee on conscientious refusal. And the explicit examples that were given there had to do with, obstetricians, gynecologists who do not want to provide abortion services, and which is, ACOG is a pro-abortion organization, but it also, welcomes, right, the beliefs of all of its members. But when that paper came out on conscientious refusal, and it said that, of course, clinicians have the right to conscientious refusal, but you must, as Mary and Katie have both said, you must make a referral. right? You don't have to perform the procedure, but your patient's interests come before yours, and you need to make a referral to someone who will. When that paper came out, there was an explosion in Washington, D.C. ACOG heard from members of the House, members of the Senate, the Director of Health and Human Services. We had to fly to the committee members had to fly to D.C. to have an emergency meeting with the ACOG leadership, who stood by that committee opinion, right, and clarified it. And the reason that there was, an explosion in D.C. was that they misunderstood, they misread the paper, right? And ACOG as an organization actually has the right to sanction its members who violate their code of ethics, right? And so that's not what the ethics committee was calling for in its paper. However, I do want to say that ACOG, to my knowledge, has yet to sanction members, right, who have violated their code of ethics, including refusal to refer. And that would be symbolic, but I think that it's important. I think it's an important message, certainly to members of that professional organization.
Well, it's not symbolic, in particular in states that go dark, to say, the state next to us, abortion is legal, right? Yeah. And letting patients even know of that option.
Yeah. I didn't mean that not referring was symbolic. I meant that ACOG not sanctioning members who violate the code of ethics, right? It's meaningless, right? If you don't do it, right? It's It's kind of like the idea that, there's informed consent. The other side of that is the right to refuse, right? And informed consent is meaningless without the right to say no.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to take one more of our prepared questions and then move on to a number of questions that we have from the audience. There's two different other issues that are going on in society right now. Vaccine mandates for COVID-19, as well as the issue of gun rights. And this interplay of the decisions that we're expecting from the Supreme Court on abortion and how those interface. So, for example, just recently we saw that the Supreme Court did not uphold OSHA's ability to have a very broad vaccine mandate. They upheld a mandate in a separate case for healthcare workers. And then additionally, we've seen, for example, in California in December of last year, Gavin Newsom proposed a model for an assault weapons ban utilizing the Texas abortion law, SB 8. So if any of the three of you have comments on either or both of those, I'd be very interested to hear them.
Mary?
Sure. I think... So, I mean, I had very publicly said that I thought that the Supreme Court was still sort of the Supreme Court of Chief Justice John Roberts, in the sense that the court was conservative, but concerned about different kinds of legitimacy. So when we talk about legitimacy, we could mean legitimacy within the legal community. We could mean legitimacy within the medical community. We could mean some kind of broader sense of political legitimacy, and that wouldn't necessarily change the outcomes we would see on issues from guns to abortion, but that it might change the timing or the method or the explanation that the court would use. And every signal we've seen in the SB 8 litigation, in the types of cases the court is taking, in their handling of the OSHA mandate, in their expansion of what attorneys are calling the shadow docket, that the court seems not really concerned about any of these kinds of different threats to its legitimacy, or convinced that there is no such threat to its legitimacy. So I think, if anything, we should read the court's decision to reverse Roe, not just to reverse Roe, because you have to remember, right, the court, it would be reversing Roe after, I think, kind of gratuitously allowing SB 8 to stand, allowing it to be in effect since September, which really would have been no skin off the court's back, right? If the court was going to overrule Roe anyway, it could look as if it was a neutral arbiter of the law by simply saying SB 8 style mechanisms are bad, right? And saying SB 8 isn't okay, and then simply allowing Texas to ban abortion a few months later anyway, which is probably what's going to happen. The court didn't bother to do that because it's not concerned about threats to its legitimacy. A court concerned about threats to its legitimacy probably wouldn't reverse Roe as soon as its partisan composition changes, but that's not what's going to happen. The court is probably going to reverse Roe as soon as its partisan composition changes. So I think a reversal of Roe will probably be a kind of, canary in the coal mine for what we would expect from this court on a variety of other issues, because as many folks have documented, Roe is the best known, highest salient Supreme Court decision, right? So a lot of Americans that are not aware of or know anything about what the Supreme Court is doing on other issues know what Roe is and have an opinion on whether the court should overrule it. And we know that polling suggests that Americans overwhelmingly don't want the court to do that. So if the court doesn't care about a potential political fallout from that, we should expect them not to care about political fallout on a whole variety of other issues of concern to bioethicists. So I think, one question would be, would the court sustain an SB 8 style law that went after guns? I mean, the reason to say no would be because that would make the court look hypocritical, or that would make the court look partisan. But there's so many other things that might make the court look partisan that aren't raising red flags for the court's majority that I think it's quite possible the court could find a distinction. And through creative lawyering, one can always find a distinction if one wants to look hard enough. So I think this is just sort of, I would say, just the beginning of changes that we might see through the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think it's an issue of abortion exceptionalism as well. And Griswold should fall. I mean, it depends on the basis for a ruling on Roe, but it might not, just because they'll find a distinction. And it was really interesting and heartbreaking in a way in the Dobbs oral arguments to hear the more conservative justices kind of making the pitch why this wouldn't have to affect any other precedent, as if they're just unrelated. And the SB 8 thing, I just want to underscore how utterly scandalous and depressing it is in terms of institutional legitimacy. Imagine that Texas had said, we're going to segregate the schools. We're going to shut down all the newspapers, just anything else that's just so obviously unconstitutional. Do you imagine a Supreme Court saying wow, that's procedurally tricky? We'll allow there to be no free press for 5-6 months, and we'll let the Fifth Circuit just sit on it. It's just unimaginable. But I think we have a court, a majority of true believers here. And so you heard in the Dobbs arguments, both Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Alito openly ask and assume fetuses have interests. And that's just so radical and so new to say out loud, because Roe through Casey, it's the state has an interest in potential life, very carefully never granting any right or interest to the embryo or fetus itself. I think there's lots of questions of why states would have interest in potential life that would be superior to and counter to the person in whom it lives, but that's a separate conversation. Here, they're just openly saying fetus have an interest in life. That's a new constitutional concept that, as Mary said, they'd say, well, guns are different. Read the Second Amendment, right? So for better or worse, I think those who are more in more progressive circles who say, hey, if you can't beat them, join them, are going to be disappointed.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to a few of the questions from our Q&A with our final 8 minutes. There are a number of participants who have asked specifically about restrictions on abortion that are related to genetic diagnoses made for fetuses. And there's multiple questions here, so I'm just trying to sort of synthesize them. Here's one. I'm interested in how one sees a difference in abortion in general versus abortion in the case of a fetus diagnosed with a genetic syndrome such as Down syndrome. Does the latter have a string of eugenics that we should be concerned about?
I'll offer that 2 points. One is political. What the anti-abortion movement has done in a very successful way is what a colleague of mine calls a Velcro move, which is to take a familiar accepted concept and then tack something else onto it. So we have this accepted and wonderful civil rights narrative, and then to say we're going to ban abortion for sex selection, race, no one's aborting because of race, and disability clicks in, it Velcros to this widely accepted narrative. The problem with bans, reason bans, is they give embryos or fetuses the statuses of persons, right? So we don't discriminate against people with disabilities, but an embryo with a genetic diagnosis is, to me, not the same as a person with a disability. So that's speaking legally and politically to that move. I think most people are unaware, because of Texas and Dobbs, that the Sixth Circuit has upheld a reason ban. And it's not being appealed to the Supreme Court for good reason, because litigators don't want the court to touch it right now. But Coney Barrett and Justice Thomas have been very on the record of supporting those bans. So in the Sixth Circuit, you actually, which is a section of the United States, multiple states focused, the case came out of Ohio, I believe, you can't get an abortion if you let the provider know it's for example, a Down syndrome diagnosis. Ethically, I'm troubled by this. I'm very concerned and very interested and very supportive of disability rights. But I also don't think that a couples or individuals' decision to terminate a pregnancy because of genetic diagnosis is necessarily a discriminatory statement. And I want to reframe it and just offer another way to think of it. I think it's a comment on their ability to parent a child with extra need. X or Y. I mean that as a placeholder, so just as someone might say, I can parent the 3 children I have, but I can't possibly take on a 4th. A potential parent saying, I could parent a child of average health, but I can't take on a child with this particular health need or cognitive challenge. I think to me, isn't necessarily discriminatory. And I don't think that contradicts a social movement to make those who do choose to parent children with challenges much easier and more supported. We're really not a family-friendly country to people with children of average health, and people with children who have special needs just have incredible economic burdens and life changes that many of them willingly and joyfully take on. But for those who say, I can't do that, I don't necessarily want to put a eugenics label on them. Eugenics is when the government says this class or group of people is not worthy of living. That's a political and governmental decision. Private decision-making could have stigma and discrimination in swimming in it, but it might not. And it's not the same as eugenics, but I appreciate and I'm very invested in those concerns as well.
Can I make 2 points, Alyssa, and I will make them brief about this. And one is I want to point out that Gonzalez v. Carhart actually, in an indirect way, assigned precedent to fetal health above that of the pregnant person. And the reason I'm mentioning that, not only for what's inherent in that statement, but is that incorporated into their finding were 2 notions that had been discredited by then and certainly continue to be. One is that there is decisional regret, right, by persons who have abortions. And the other is that those making the decision to have an abortion are vulnerable females. And this idea that a pregnant person, right, is somehow vulnerable and incapable of making their own healthcare decisions, I think is just anathema to the idea of respect for autonomy. My second point is this, that one consequence of abortion bans in this particular arena may very well mean coerced fetal surgeries for pregnant persons who have a fetus that has an anomaly for which there could be the opportunity for a surgery on that fetus. And so you may not be pregnant by choice. You may not continue that pregnancy by choice, but that might also evolve into coercion, pressure to have fetal surgery that isn't a choice.
Thank you. Additionally, as the physician on this panel, I'd like to just briefly point out in our conversation about Down syndrome is that oftentimes it is referred to as one single entity, as though every child who's diagnosed with trisomy 21 has exactly the same outcomes. I think it's just very important to recognize that there are a number of additional health conditions that may happen with trisomy 21. And so a person choosing to have an abortion may not be related to the diagnosis of trisomy 21, but rather additionally because of the many comorbid conditions that child may also display, for example, on a scanning ultrasound. So I just wanted to point out that it really can be far more complex than a single diagnosis. for persons who are making those decisions. There is a question from Rosamond Rones that I wonder, Mary Faith, if you can answer. Does ACOG take a position on hospitals that refuse to allow doctors to refer patients for abortion or offer contraception?
Hi, Rosamond. Not that I know of. And so I think that, the only kind of alternative, at least in terms of individual clinicians, physicians who may be members of ACOG, as I mentioned before, would be the notion of a sanction by their professional organization. And relative to what you just said, Alyssa, I want to just recall for all of us that Ron Johnson's recent statement that families that parents choose to have children, and that therefore the state shouldn't offer any support for families or children who need financial or other sorts of support.
Thank you. In our final minute, I wonder if each of you has one final takeaway for our audience. I wish we had time for every single question. There are some incredible ones in here that I wish we had time for. Katie, may I go to you first?
So the final thought on this, things are going to get worse before they get better. So don't kid yourself. And I think for those who find this a problem, the question is, how do we go into action to support our patients, to support our colleagues, whether we're in a state that goes dark, a state that's receiving patients. But I also want to emphasize that before they get better part. I am maybe just a born optimist. And I want to say that this is like the court reversing Brown versus Board, 49 years later, and be like, just kidding, separate can be equal. I really don't think that Americans would be like, oh, well, it was a good run. Too bad, right? There's going to be just incredible conflict about this. And I just want to say, don't be scared of conflict. It's okay. Sometimes it's what couples counselors call productive fighting. So let's have productive fighting, and don't be scared and say, well, it's abortion. I can't be involved. It's too messy. It's religious. I'm not a woman, whatever. Let's engage. This is a time where silence is assent.
Thank you. Mary Ziegler, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, as a historian, when I think of what happens next, I think of Harry Blackman, when he wrote Roe, had a paper in his files, a clipping of a poll that said, 70-something% of Americans think abortion should be a decision between a woman and her doctor. And he thought that because he believed that Roe would settle the debate. Now, of course, it didn't, but at least Roe was, in line with majority opinion. So I agree entirely with Katie that it's absolutely ridiculous, if you know anything about the history of this, to expect that the Supreme Court will have the final word. But what happens next, I think, is largely to be determined, right? I mean, to what extent there is a political backlash that changes elections, or that changes the Supreme Court, or gives the Supreme Court pause, or gives legislators in a variety of states reason to act, really depends on what everyone does next. And I think people in the medical community historically have had more of a say, for better or worse, in what those policies look like than other stakeholders have. And so I think the feeling many people have in knowing that the Supreme Court will likely overrule Roe in June and that there's nothing to be done about it is a feeling of powerlessness. But I think history counsels that the opposite is true, and that what people decide to do now will change entirely what it means that Roe is overturned, and whether that's a permanent setback or something that's more of a step on a much longer road.
Thank you. Mary Faith.
To build on what both Katie and Mary have just said, I think it is a time to get into good trouble, if you will. And maybe one of the most important things is to convey to people, to persons, on either side of the debate or in the middle, what the effects are, the potential effects and the real effects are on all of us, not just some of us, but all of us, on our health and our well-being.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for attending this American Journal of Bioethics webinar at the end of Roe v. Wade. We appreciate your time and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.